Welcome to the Nomiki Show. I am Nomiki Konst. You are watching or listening to a very special interview. As many of you know who are live show listeners and viewers, we are pre-recording for the holiday weekend in the US. It's Thanksgiving weekend. And today's recording, while it's recorded on Wednesday, is for Feminist Friday, for Fem Friday, as we like to call it. And I'm very excited about this interview. It's not a traditional show. We're just going to do two interviews back to back. So you're getting a lot of juice and meatiness here, but you know, we have to make sure that we respect our team and their lives, because isn't that what this is all about? So our guest today is Leslie Kern. She is a professor at Mount Allison University, and she is the author of Feminist City. This is a book that's getting a lot of attention. It's published by Verso. Feminist City: Claiming Space in a Man-Made World. She also holds a PhD in Women's Studies from York University, and is currently an associate professor of Geography and Environment and director of Women's and Gender Studies at Mount Allison University. I think this book is basically like what you teach in, the two things merging together. Am I correct?
Absolutely. You are totally correct. Yes. Bringing my worlds together.
It's very efficient of you, I should say. Most capitalists would say, how do I break this into 12 books and make as much money as I can as possible? But you were like, let's consolidate.
Right.
So Leslie, let's just start off with what inspired you to write this book? What's the basis of this book?
Well, you're right that this is absolutely my day job, talking about feminism, talking about cities, talking about space all of the time. But I wanted to write something that was more accessible to a wide audience, not just my fellow academic peers or students, but really to anybody who's ever lived in a city or who just cares about cities and is interested in the ways that the built environment around them might be subtly shaping their day-to-day lives in ways that we don't typically notice. So the point is to kind of get people to look differently at things that we might just take for granted as sort of common sense or always having been there, and perhaps get a new perspective on them.
I would be irresponsible. It would be irresponsible of me not to mention that much of the movements, the socialist movements, the workers' rights movements that were born out of cities like New York, where I live, were led and organized by women. The Triangle Shirt Factory is an obvious example. I think a lot of folks know about the Triangle Shirt Factory, but then also, going back through Marxist philosophy, whatever, history, how much of the workers' movements and how much of the socialist change was to come out of, the theory was to come out of urban environments. So I find this really interesting because, as somebody who likes to talk about feminist socialism and feminism in class, I feel like this is a piece of the conversation that's just left out and has just always been in front of our faces. So for you to put these two ideas together, it shouldn't be revolutionary, but it seems revolutionary to me, and it's probably why your book is getting so much attention. So let's talk about historically how cities and gender kind of played up against each other.
Sure. So I'll just qualify this by saying that I'm talking kind of about cities of the global north here when I'm speaking. So I don't want to pretend to be representing the entire world, which is kind of one of the common problems in urban studies and even feminism. But during the time of the Industrial Revolution, cities were growing really quickly. They were bringing all sorts of different groups of people. And in societies where there had been a kind of a rigid class and gender structure set up, this rapid urbanization, this coming together, this literal shoulder rubbing of different groups of people with one another was kind of destabilizing to these norms of kind of people's social status, people's delineated positions in society, when all of a sudden you couldn't necessarily tell who was who and where they belonged. And for women, this was a particular problem because the desire to sort of protect the purity, morality, and virtue of, for example, the Victorian upper class white woman was very strong. And if this woman was out in public, again, literally rubbing shoulders with the wrong sorts of people, then the ultimate insult might happen, which would be to be mistaken for a public woman or a sex worker. So the growth of cities was this time when all sorts of social norms were being really shaken up, including norms around gender, and raised all these questions such as, do we need to control women in cities, or do we need to control cities so that we don't end up with all of this, really messed up, confusing new ways of being in the world?
And how much of that was because cities were growing with immigration and you had multiple cultures coming in that may have different nuanced perspectives on how women were to be treated and acknowledged and work, et cetera?
That's a great point. So all sorts of differences, to lump them under that category, would perhaps have been seen as threats because, again, we were not able to be kind of slotting people in and saying, this is your place, this is exactly where you belong, this is your physical environment that you need to stay in. And with this rapid growth, cities just teeming with people coming from all over the world, and again, different classes of people mingling in ways that they simply hadn't before, this was perceived as a threat to everything that was held to be kind of normal and natural and very right.
So I'm glad that you mentioned Victorian women because, so much of the feminist movement has been framed around white, wealthy women, right? How much does the Victorian woman's perspective play up against, say, like as we get into like the suffragettes, for instance?
Yeah, absolutely. So certainly this desire to protect a certain group of women was very much directed at a very privileged group of women in the city, and the other groups of women in the city, working class women, women of color, sex workers, these women were seen as a problem for urban society. So there wasn't a lot of maybe overlap or sense that the concerns of these two groups really overlapped or matched up in any way. And I think when we come to the period of the suffragettes, the women that they were advocating for were very much those upper class women, women with some education and status, and who were married to property owning men and were seen as having a legitimate stake in the political future of the country, while other groups of women were again positioned as more of problems for society rather than as women who would be contributing to the solutions that the suffragettes were looking for.
So how does this play out in modern times?
Well, I think it's fair to say that, well, we don't have the same level of Victorian type restrictions on women's presence in public space. There are still many ways that women are perceived as problems for the city, or we are perceived as bodies that need to be controlled in some way. And I think we can notice this very much in our everyday lives as women in cities, where we think about what we're wearing. We think about where we're going in public. We think about who knows we're there. We think about the way that we behave. So we have this kind of internalized social control. There's also the perception that groups of women, again, to this day, sex workers, for example, are signs of disorder and disruption in the urban environment, and their behavior needs to be controlled. And of course, women of color, the stereotype of something like the welfare queen, which is, a hideously racist stereotype from the 1970s that we still see lingering around as sources of kind of urban disorder, urban decay, urban abandonment.
But it's so ironic now because, pre-pandemic, cities were thriving definitely more than rural communities. New York's, where I live, I'll just use an example because it's on the minds of everybody in the United States all the time because it's always brought up. But New York, the income inequality was starker than ever, but the wealth was it's just so overwhelming, and as a result, crime has gone down. And of course, there's a legacy of all these policies, these racist policies. But in today's world, prior to the pandemic, who is there to control? There's not unruly behavior on the streets. Times Square is quote unquote cleaned up. And of course, this happened in cities across the global north, as you mentioned, like the especially the United States. So how does this relate to a moment in which women are speaking up about inequity, specifically in terms of how inequity relates to them, trans women in particular. When we talk about women, let me just make that very clear. We're talking about all women. Of course, historically in Victorian era, that wasn't a conscious piece of vocabulary, but all women. So how does it relate to the inequities today? I mean, it's strange because cities are richer than ever. They're Democratic run for the most part, across America in particular. We're progressively run, or more left-leaning, wherever you are in the globe, neoliberal. Yet the inequity is starker than ever. And you still have immigrant populations, different waves of immigrants coming in. So how does this inequity brush up against the sexism that exists in cities today?
It's a great question. This is a kind of ongoing tension, I think, in feminist thinking about cities, because on the one hand, we recognize that cities are places of great potential empowerment for women, all sorts of women. Women continue from, the Industrial Revolution to today to flock to cities looking for employment opportunities, looking for ways of being in different sorts of familial and kinship relations, for breaking out of traditional rural kinship and religious traditions and so on. But inequalities follow us even in the city. So women are more likely to be precariously housed, for example. They are more likely to be displaced by gentrification or to be affected by policies that are kind of dismantling public housing, for example. Women, and especially African-American women in the US, are some of the largest groups that populate public housing projects. Women, of course, still experience a wage gap, which greatly impacts our ability to enjoy all of the things that the city has to offer, all of those great benefits that would seem, the riches that would seem to come from something like the cleanup of Times Square. And women are amongst the groups that are being perhaps displaced outside of cities. They can't afford to experience those benefits of urban life if they're being pushed to the kind of urban fringes, suburban areas, and even quite a long distance outside of the city, just in order to find affordable housing.
Right. So, post-pandemic, there's going to be quite a bit of conversation about what it is going to take to revive these cities. I personally don't think it's possible to even have this conversation anymore with the state of the economy and the nosedive we're going into, and the evictions crisis and the job crisis and the frontline workers being majority women, without including working women in this conversation. We cannot resuscitate this economy without saying, what is it going to take for the average domestic worker to be able to commute into work on time on a working subway that's funded, and have housing close enough so that they get to work in time, have PPE or whatever it takes, the vaccine, healthcare, childcare, so that we can completely revive these cities, so that the richest of the rich can continue to have their profits off of whatever they're doing on Wall Street. So, I mean, in terms of let's talk through some of the big ones, right? You mentioned housing. You mentioned public housing. I mean, that's a fascinating statistic I think a lot of folks aren't aware of, is majority of folks in at least US public housing, women-led households by far, which, leads to other conversations about other policies leading to that. So let's talk about housing. What would it take to make sure to protect women that could be losing their housing? Is it just blocking evictions, or is there more that could be presented?
You're absolutely right. Housing is such a huge piece of it, and it remains a real stumbling block to all forms of equality. So yes, preventing evictions is a great first step. That's kind of like the minimum baseline. Make sure people are not kicked out onto the street or into the, inadequate and somewhat dangerous shelter system. We can also talk about things like limiting rent increases. We can talk about reviving rent control programs. We can talk about ways of encouraging private developers to have to include more affordable units, although what counts as affordable in a city like New York are probably units that still cost $500,000. So there needs to be kind of a reality check on what affordability looks like, because you're absolutely right. In many cities like New York and San Francisco, people like teachers and nurses who are still majority women can't afford to live in the cities where they are supposed to work. And we've seen with the pandemic stories of something like hundreds of thousands of women being out of work, partly because they've lost their jobs and partly because they are not able to juggle all of the enhanced care labor responsibilities that have just been shoved on their shoulders with this return to being in the home and children being out of school and so on. So I think we're going to see that this is it is part of an economic crisis, although I think there's still this assumption that somehow women's work doesn't count for as much as men's work.
I'm glad you bring that up. Can you explain a little bit more about this, the domestic price tag, especially during a pandemic?
Yes, this is something that's come up so much. Obviously, I wrote the book before the pandemic, so I could not have predicted that this would be one of the major issues that I would be talking about over and over again. But I feel like I'm happy to talk about it because it is still the case in the exciting year 2020 that women still do a disproportionate share of unpaid labor in the home. This labor tends to be invisible. It's very undervalued. It can even be stigmatized and seen as just a not very desirable kind of work to do. And yet this is the work that literally keeps this thing that we call the economy, that we're all supposed to be out there risking our lives to save. It's the thing that keeps the economy going. You can't have the economy without people being fed, without children being looked after, without sick people being cared for. There's none of that happens without care labor. So this is perhaps a moment where we can make care labor visible, where we can make gendered inequalities in care labor visible, and we can push for something different in the future.
So in terms of pandemic response, what would you say, because I do think this list brushes up against your book quite a bit in terms of building a more livable city that includes women. Say that in jest. But also, what are some top issues you think that we should put forward as a movement? I mean, really, I think like if folks are more aware of how much this crisis affects women, more so, especially women on the front lines and women of color and immigrant women, what are some of the issues that we should be putting on the table right now and saying like non-negotiable, we got to do it or else it's the demise?
Right. So we've already mentioned housing, so I won't say too much more about that. But we could also talk about public space and the public realm in general. So as we're all being encouraged to make more use of, for example, outdoor public spaces for our own safety and health, we have to ask questions about the safety of these spaces, their inclusiveness, and their accessibility. And accessibility is really a broad term that, of course, applies to accessibility for disabled people, but is also wider than that. When we think about the fact that we all have certain human needs, like we all need to use the bathroom, we all need to sit and rest, we all need water and shade and shelter. And yet most of our urban public environments have not really been set up to provide these things. In other words, they're not set up to provide for care labor. So I wonder if we could push for things like, can we think about our public spaces as places where we provide collective labor, where we feed people, for example, where children can have their classrooms, right, where work can be done. And this really requires somewhat radical rethinking of what public space is for in today's cities.
How about healthcare?
Yes, absolutely. Healthcare is a huge issue. I'm from Canada, so we have a slightly different experience with that, but we do also have it just slightly. Yet at the same time, we have problems with the healthcare system being underfunded, with the workers in the healthcare system not being paid as well as they should, especially workers who do the kind of, again, feminized work or the sort of racialized labor of cleaning and working in long-term care homes. So I think healthcare and the pandemic has really illustrated, and again, even here in Canada, where things are so good comparatively, we still see racial inequalities in terms of who's getting sick from COVID. This has a lot to do with where people live and the kinds of jobs that people in those communities do, which is the essential work of keeping our cities running. So to me, one of the big things about healthcare is that we can't continue to ignore racial, class, and gender inequalities in the healthcare system.
How about transportation?
Yes, transportation is huge as well. The typical urban transportation network is really set up to kind of maximize the efficiency of bringing your breadwinner, husband and father from the suburbs into the central city to work in the office from 9 to 5 and go home, or for him to take his private vehicle and do that. But research over the last at least 50 years has shown that for most women, that system doesn't work as well. Women are more likely to make multiple journeys, to have less linear trips because they're dropping off children, they're picking up groceries, they're going and checking on an elderly parent, as well as going to their paid work. So transportation systems, if we want to imagine a city that prioritizes care work, need to do more than just move people in this kind of linear direction at one point in time. And affordability is also a huge issue for transit systems. Like, children should be free. Let me just say that. Why do we charge children to use public transportation? So women do tend to pay kind of extra in the realm of transportation because they have to transport children. They are looking for different and safer ways of getting around the city. They have less access to a private vehicle. So those affordability questions are key as well.
It's interesting that you mentioned that about coming in, and I'll use New York as an example. There's 5 boroughs of New York. The Queens and Brooklyn literally are next to each other. There's just like a little line that blocks them off. Yet it is mostly impossible to get from Queens to Brooklyn without going fully through Manhattan and then around. And of course, it extends your trip quite a bit. And not to mention that the subway is under austerity, and that causes a bunch of other issues like delays, losing your job, being late to pick up your kids, having to take a taxi or, God forbid, an Uber or Lyft, and that costing you $50 to $60. I mean, there's like cost upon cost. What about climate?
Oh, climate, such a great question. We're focused right now on this COVID crisis, but of course the climate crisis is here, it's been here, and it's going to be continuing to affect our cities. And I think we do need to take an equity lens along with our sustainability lens, because if we think solely about sustainability in terms of climate and green jobs and green energy, but we leave out the questions around gender, race and ability and age and so on, then I think we're going to end up reproducing some of the same problems. So on a very real day-to-day basis, we might be asking questions like, who can afford to experience a sustainable city? We can ask, who is able to do things like bike and walk instead of driving a car? We can ask, who is doing the work of the everyday stuff of recycling, for example, or washing out all of your reusable containers? The gender division of labor, I think, will play out in terms of sustainability policy as well.
I'm going to ask, like, just because this is your background a little bit more, is there something in city planning other than public space, just like the design of this city, that could affect, I don't know if any city can go back and like redraw certain things, but in an ideal world, if you were to draw a city today overnight, how would you design it so that it was more equitable?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I don't know if you've heard people talking about concepts like the 15-minute city, which is the idea of an urban environment where different urban uses are not so segregated. So it was a trend in city planning for a long time to have residential areas over in one place, business in another, schools and institutions in another, green space in another, central business district in another. And again, works okay if you're taking a linear journey from one space to the next. But feminists have long argued that what women need is a greater interconnection of these spaces. So if I was redesigning spaces or encouraging new kinds of city plans, that would be one of the key things. And the idea of the 15-minute city would be that you can access work, home, groceries, social services, schools, green spaces, all within about a 15-minute walk, bike, or transit ride of your home. And this is a gender equity position as well. We do a lot for those concerns.
I hear you. I mean, just playing into like food deserts, for instance, and recognizing just inequities from that perspective as well. Before we wrap up, I would love to throw out a challenge of what are some of the least constructive feminist ideas, policies out there being proposed that could possibly be diverting attention away from more constructive, policy proposals?
This is a tough question. Well, I think when we have a focus on women solely in terms of business and capitalism and enterprise, of women as CEOs, and so on, we tend to lose sight of the most vulnerable women in society. We tend to lose sight of the things that would actually create the broadest equality for the widest number of groups. So again, issues like affordable housing, free public transportation, these are not things that we see as kind of at the top of a lot of mainstream feminist agendas, but in reality, they are the things that would concretely, materially change the lives of the vast majority of women.
Meaning the lean-in Sheryl Sandberg crowd is not thinking about, should the subway be free or funded, or should we have public housing and affordable housing, or et cetera. Yeah, exactly. I hear you. I always like to throw that out there. Leslie Kern, fascinating conversation, sort of rapid fire, but that's what we have to do on these shows. Pleasure to have you. Hope to have you back on. You can check out Leslie Kern's book. It's called Feminist City. It's on what would make a city more feminist, claiming space in a man-made world. Thanks for watching and listening to The Nomiki Show. But remember to click like and subscribe on YouTube, and please share on social media. If you're not already a patron, please join us for as low as $5 a month on patreon.com/The Nomiki Show for early and special content. That investment makes a huge difference. We are not corporate media raking in the dough. It's really you guys that are keeping us going. So please consider being a patron. And to our current patrons, thank you so much. We are incredibly grateful to you. We also now have swag. So check us out on thenomikishow.com to get your mugs, your totes, and your stickers.